Hello again, everyone. I am glad to be back with you and thank you for sharing this conversation with me. Today we're talking about birches. Not all of them, but only those that are common around here in eastern Massachusetts, and also those that have been around with us even closer here at NewBridge. So I can't believe time flies very quickly, and now it's almost summer. We are approaching summer. It's the end of the spring. I can't believe it. Look at these maples. They are all fruiting now. They produced fruit, and they changed their color from purplish pink to this brick pink. This is red maple planted here on our property, and some of them have been already producing leaves because our maples first flower and produce fruit, and only after that they develop leaves. So it feels summerish when they look like that. And look at the oaks. Oaks are the latest to come out in spring, and yet they are already developing. And then these high bush blueberries that are planted around the campus, they are so nice and beautiful. All of these things grow here naturally, and yet they are planted on the campus, and that's a delight to look at them. Look at the bumblebees that are buzzing around the blueberries. And eastern redbud is starting to open. This is mostly flower buds, but some of the flowers are already open. Eastern red bud is called Cercis canadensis in Latin, but this name is a little bit misleading because actually, as it is shown over here, its area is south of us. So it's indigenous to the United States, to North America, but it's not native to Massachusetts. In fact, not native anywhere in New England. So it's one tree that is not native here. It's a real beauty though. And finally, let's look at the birches. And this is the first birch that we're going to take a look at. And this is one of my favorites. It's called gray birch. And its Latin name is Betula populifolia. Now, populifolia means with leaves a little bit like poplar, but Betula is the name for all birches. This is the genus birch, it's called Betula. And if I ask you what does Betula mean, well, it's birch, but this name per se is not even a Latin name, it's a Celtic word. It's betu or beth or base in Irish. And believe it or not, it's connected with Shakespeare's Macbeth because Macbeth is translated son of a birch. And also the same root shows up in Hebrew. In Hebrew, Beth, Beit means house, like part of the name Bethlehem. So yeah, that's Betula. Let's remember that word. Betula means birch in many languages. And we're looking at this gray birch, which has been planted around the campus and at the same time growing around wild. Well, this is planted along the main road. We can immediately see that this tree is multi-stem. It's like a big, big bush. And if you look a little closer, you'll see that the bark is not quite white. It's one of those white birches, um, but the bark is kind of grayish because it's full of little lenticels, and also it is not exfoliating. It is very, very tight to the stem. And the catkins, here it is flowering. Look, here are the catkins. Uh, they are coming out together with young leaves, and the catkins are solitary, one catkin at a time. Catkin are inflorescences of uh, birches and other trees that produce this type of flowers. They are called amentiferous plants. And another name for catkins is aments. Some people say aments, others catkins. So I believe I belong to the tribe that uses catkins more often. So catkins in birches are actually in two types. If you look a little closer, here are leaves. Leaves are in this birch, they are triangular in shape and with this thin and long point tip. Tip is attenuated, long and thin. And look, leaves come in pairs. Two leaves are coming from one bud. And this is actually typical for all birches. So if you are in doubt whether the tree is a birch or not, you can look at this character. And if you find these paired leaves on some branches, usually those that are better lighted, that means you are dealing with a birch. So it's a very interesting, cool character. And here is a closer view of this catkin. And as I said, catkins are of two types. This is a male catkin, meaning that the little flowers that are assembled in the catkin all contain stamens, only stamens, and produce pollens. There are no pistils because pistillate flowers are in different type of catkins. They are shorter, like this, and they don't. They are stiffer too, and they don't hang down very much. So this gray birch is my favorite birch because from my perspective, it's a one normal birch in this country. That's what I'm used to think of when I say a birch, because I'm coming from Eastern Europe, from Russia, where there are no other birches other than birches like this one. So this gray birch is very closely related to the European birches, similarly looking like this one. So this is one of them growing wild on the property. And this photograph is the same as on my opening title photo, and it shows you that this birch is not necessarily multi-stem. It can grow rather big and one trunk. And this is an important tree around here. It's a successional tree, and that means that it grows on abandoned land. If the land is burned or cleared and the succession starting from scratch all over again, it's short-lived. Also can be called pioneer tree in the same respect. And it is coming and quickly going away, relatively quickly, relatively to other birches that are longer lived. And if you look a little closer, you'll see that there are black triangles on the bark that is also a typical feature of this particular birch. This was taken, the photograph was taken in Western Massachusetts on a margin of an abandoned pasture, and it is full of juniper, common juniper, and on the very margin there is this grove of gray birches. Multi-stem birch in the Blue Hills Reservation. And here is a close-up view of the bark finally. You see this very typical large black triangles under many branches, actually under each big branch. And this is how you identify this birch. And also look at the bark. It's not quite white, it's grayish because there is plenty of lenticels that make it dirty white. And the bark is not exfoliating, it is very tight, tightly packed on the trunk. Here is another interesting picture. The centerpiece of it is slanted gray birches. This is on the shore of Weymouth Great Pond. You can see this blue color behind the grove. And this is the water of the pond, Weymouth Great Pond. And the strange thing about this photograph is that other trees are standing straight, vertical, and it's only these birches that are slanting on the right. And this photograph, this view actually has been a question mark to me for a long time. I was looking for an answer. What happened to the birches here? Because if you think this is because of the winds from the pond, then why in the world the birches are slanting towards the pond and not away from the pond? And why it's just birches and not other trees? So very unexpectedly, I found the answer to this question in Robert Frost's poem about birches. And he said in this poem, truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storm. So he explains in the poem how ice storms do this damage to birches, but in his poem, ice storms are doing even more extreme damage because the birches are totally bent to the ground. Well, let's read a little bit of it. It's even longer than that, so I don't dare to read to you the entire poem, but let's read the beginning. Across the lines of straighter, darker trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them. But swinging doesn't bend them down to stay, as ice storms do. Often you must have seen them loaded with ice. A sunny winter morning when I see birches bent to left and right after a rain, they click upon themselves as the breeze rises and turn many-colored as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. Soon the sun's warmth make them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust, such heaps of broken glass to sweep away, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. They are dragged to the withered bracken by the road, and they seem not to break, though once they are bowed for so long, they never right themselves. You may see their trunks arching in the woods years afterwards, trailing their leaves on the ground like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun. But I was going to say, when truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storm, I should prefer to have some boy bend them. as he went out and in to fetch the cows, some boy too far from town to learn baseball, whose only play was what he found himself, summer, winter, and could play alone. And so he goes on, thinking about that imaginary boy and probably about his own childhood. And it's a very sweet and sad poem, actually. But if you like it, you'd have to read on your own. So let's go back to our gray birch and take the last glance at it and look at its geographic range as it is presented in the flora of North America. As you can see, it's a very eastern North American tree, and we are finding ourselves in the very center of its distribution. So it's a very, very common tree around here and very unassuming tree. But let's look at what else is planted on campus. I'm sure you have noticed these special trees. They are planted in many, many places around the campus, and these are the famous river birches. They have this interesting shaggy bark that's exfoliating in colorful shaggs from white uh, to yellow and purple and reddish and orange, all different tints of color. And because of that, they're very picturesque, of course, and they have become fashionable as horticultural trees all of a sudden during the last 20 years at least. And even though they're called river birch for good reason, they do grow along rivers and even in rivers. They are doing as well, very well, as you can see near the houses in just average garden soil away from any river. And there have been developed many cultivars. For example, there is a very popular cultivar that's called Heritage. And so many people just know these birches under this name. I had this, I remember, funny episode when I worked at the Arboretum. Uh, we have interns at the Arboretum every summer. And so I was talking to an intern, young lady, and we were walking around the Arboretum and looking at trees. And I asked her if she recognized a tree and pointed to a river birch. And she said, but of course I know it, it's heritage birch. So she only knew it under this name, heritage birch. So heritage birches are a staple around our properties. You can see here's another bunch of birches planted along the main entrance road, and one more at the very entrance. Very beautiful trees. And uh, the catkins that contain stamens, the male catkins, are not one by one. They are in groups here. Remember I told you about gray birches, that was a unique property of hers because her catkins were solitary. And so if you see solitary catkins, you can tell this is a gray birch, but all the rest of them have catkins in groups. Here you can see there's groups of 3 and even 4. And the Latin name of river birch is Betula nigra. And nigra, of course, means black. And you would say, why in the world it has this name, black, if it's so colorful? The bark is very colorful. Well, the secret is that when this birch gets older with age, it loses all these colorful shacks and becomes darker and darker. Like here in this old venerable birch, you see younger parts of like higher in the crown. They still have some color, but the bottom parts of the trunks are dark black. So with age, it becomes truly black. And the habitat here is very wet. You see phragmites and red maples growing around here. And this birch actually stands uh, knee-high in water. This is in the Neponset River floodplain, which gets flooded periodically. So that's the favorite habitat of river birch. And another favorite habitat of hers is bank of river with swiftly running water. This is a photograph taken in spring and not far from here. I hope to be able to explain where it is. This place is called Long Ditch and it's in Dedham. So here is the map. Here is our campus, NewBridge on the Charles over here. And as you know, we are very close to the Charles itself. And the Charles is making these big loops, very interesting loops. It's called meandering. So it's meandering on the floodplain, and it does a very interesting trick here. It goes all the way south, and then it turns 180 degrees and goes back all the way north, making this huge loop, and it ends nearly at the same place where it started. So imagine all those early settlers who were using this river as a highway, as we're using highway now, and they are uh, going down the river all the way down, only to turn back and go all the way back in order to get somewhere. I imagine it could be very frustrating. And so what they did, they dug this channel that made a shortcut between these two branches, and so they don't have to go all the way around. And it is labeled here Charles River, but it's a wrong name because this channel has its own name and it's called the Long Ditch. And it is quite deep, and you can navigate in an inflated boat or in canoe, and it is probably some 20 yards or maybe 10 yards in other places wide. And so the photograph that I showed you was taken right here at the confluence of the Charles and this long ditch where Needham Street crosses the long ditch. And you imagine that there must be a bridge in order for Needham Street to proceed. And so here is that bridge, the way it used to be before it was reconstructed, some 5 years ago, I would say. But before that, it was quite dilapidated, and trees grew, right on the bridge, at the bottom of the bridge, in the middle of the river. So this is, of course, a river birch. That's why I'm showing this photograph to you. So river birches are not shy to step right to the middle of the river and grow right there at the very middle. And so we are looking here at the front. This is the water of Long Ditch, but in the back there, where the water is more calm, this is already the Charles. So again, this is this particular spot. And elsewhere in this area, along the Charles, we see the entire large population of river birches. For example, here in the center of this photographs, you see river birches growing on the bank of the Charles. And here is another photograph taken very close by here, from here. And again, all the trees around everything that you see in this frame are river birches. And these are approximately the same age, but in this population there are venerable, very old big birches and very young seedlings and saplings. So all the spectrum of ages, and it's a very nice and big population. The leaves of river birch are very special and different from triangular leaves of gray birch. These, you could say that they are rhombic even, rhombic shape, because it goes like they have four sides to them, roughly speaking. And you see that the margin has very coarse teeth, and these teeth are double, meaning that this big tooth has little teeth of the second order on its margin. So it's very special shape of leaf. No other birch in our area or elsewhere has leaves shaped like that. So it's easy to identify by the leaf. And most of the birches in our area are very easy to identify just by looking at their leaves. So it's not rocket science, really. Now let's look at the river birch range. You can tell from looking at this map that river birch is a southerner in our flora, because Massachusetts actually is at the northeastern limit of the range, and it's here that the range of this tree stops being to be continuous and is represented by a couple little chunks. And so there is no consensus even regarding all the populations of river birch in Massachusetts. People believe that many of them are introduced, and some botanists even think that the population of the Charles is not native, that it is introduced. But I don't think if they actually looked at their actual population, they wouldn't say that. So I don't buy this idea that it is not a native tree here on the Charles. I think this is a full native population. Now, let's look at a tree which is kind of a counterpart, geographical counterpart of the river birch. If the river birch were a southerner, this one is, on the contrary, a northerner in our flora. As you can see, the geographical area that it covers takes the entire northern part of North America, almost the entire northern part, excluding only Alaska. And in Massachusetts, it's becoming more common in central and western parts, where you have parts or territory that is covered by northern conifer forest, by taiga forest. That includes native spruces and firs and pines, and that's where paper birch is common. And this photograph was taken in Gardner in western Massachusetts. But in eastern Massachusetts, you sometimes also find paper birch. It is not so easy to find. Here you see how I discovered once a paper birch with a group of people, and you see that everyone is looking at it with open mouth. And the reason we were able to identify it, we spotted this trunk that is white, bright white, usually much whiter than the gray birch, and the bark, differently from the gray birch, is exfoliating. Um, Usually it's exfoliating in pieces thinner than these. Usually it's thinner layers and yeah, I will show you more typical barks. So this is another example that rare example of a population of paper birch in eastern Massachusetts, in Hingham. Whenever it occurs in warmer territories, such as southeastern Massachusetts, it chooses for its habitat cooler rocks, shaded places, like, for example, this cool cove on the ocean front in Hingham. And this is a very famous population among botanists. It was discovered by Bruce Story, who was the state botanist of Massachusetts a while ago. Three state botanists ago. After him, three other state botanists came one after another. But Bruce Story was a very good botanist, so he discovered this population and collected samples, preserved samples in the herbarium. So we discovered the samples and relocated this place according to his directions. And we're very happy to see that paper birch still exists there after so many years. Here on the left-hand side in the forefront, you can see the typical leaves of paper birch. And they look like this if you take a closer look. This is yet another shape that we haven't yet encountered, right? It's a different leaf. It has little teeth along the margin, and at the base of the leaf, it is very rounded, as if it has this plump cheeks. And so this is a very special leaf of paper birch, and no other birch has a leaf shaped like that. And even though the trunk here is not bright white, you have to look at the combinations of characters in order to judge and identify the species, because birches are very, very variable, and this birch didn't want to be as bright as it's supposed to be. But the leaves tell us that this is still a paper birch that occurred in Wareham in eastern Massachusetts. Here is the typical paper birch bark. It is exfoliating, as you can see, in very thin layers, and it is very, very bright white. And of course, when birches fall down and decay, what decays is the everything inside the bark layer, but the bark doesn't really decay. It's not prone to rotting. It is very long-lived, and this is of course true uh, with many birches, with all of them, but paper birch is perhaps the most famous of them. And its durable bark has been used in many different ways, including building the canoes, and this is the art of, that was developed by the American Indians, of course. And that's why the second name of paper birch is canoe birch. And we can even take a little detour from our conversation and watch a couple-minute video that shows you how they go about this business of building a canoe from birch bark. If you're interested, you can see a longer video, longer than that, but this one is a very short uh, primer on canoe building. Now let's watch it. You probably noticed that uh, canoe is not white, even though it's made of paper birch bark, which is white. So this is manifested in the song of Hiawatha, when Hiawatha um, addresses the birch and says, "Lay aside your cloak, O birch tree. Lay aside your white skin wrapper." So they get rid of this white skin. They clean the bark and take off this upper layer. But the most amazing thing in this Longfellow's description of canoe building that is contained in the Song of Hiawatha is this the next few lines, because it says, "Lay aside your white skin wrapper, for the summertime is coming and the sun is warm in heaven, and you need no white skin wrapper." So we have to assume that Hiawatha, that is Longfellow, knew this interesting phenomenon, was aware that during the summer, the birch doesn't need the white bark. And it implies that the white bark is needed only during the cold uh, season of the year. Why is that? This is actually a very interesting biological phenomenon. Uh, Here in this slide, you see the two maps. One is the range of paper birch. We already saw this map. And the other is another range of trembling aspen. And you see that both these trees have tremendous amplitude range of distribution in North America, and trembling aspen even wider than paper birch and goes all the way north, including Alaska. And what's interesting is that both these trees are white barked. So why is that the trees that are going record uh, far north uh, also have record light bark? So it turns out that this is biological adaptation because during the cold spells at nights, they get very cold and the temperature goes down and the entire tree's temperature goes down. And then when the sun comes up in the morning, it warms the tree up and the temperature goes up. So it fluctuates during the 24-hour day. But the way the temperature goes back up is uneven because the inside, the wood of the tree actually warms up quicker and faster and more intensively than the bark. And so during this period when the tree defrosts itself, the inside of the tree uh, pushes the bark from inside because it becomes wider faster than the bark. And the bark cracks and the tree is damaged that way. So what's the remedy for that? Well, the trees know better. They developed this adaptation that uh, lets them reflect the extensive heat during the daytime and warm up slowly so that the entire tree warms up at the same rate. And that way the tree is not damaged. So in order to be able to reflect the excess heat, trees have to have light bark. And that way all the northern trees, both northernmost trees, we should say, have very light colored bark. Aspens are also, uh, they are variable, but they have bark from white to light green. And that helps them reflect the sunlight during these critical times of the day during spring and fall. So that's the interesting adaptation. And apparently Longfellow knew about that because he said, for the summertime is coming and the sun is warm in heaven and you need no white skin wrapper. Now let's look at one more birch. Very beautiful, shiny trunk. It's called cherry or sweet birch. And in Latin, it's called Betula lenta. And lenta means shining. As you can see, this bark is very tight, not exfoliating at all, and not always it can be shiny like that. Sometimes it's not shiny, it's matte, but it's still very tight and of this characteristic dark steel gray color, almost black. Some people call this birch black birch, but I don't like this name because it seems confusing to me, because in Latin, river birch is called Betula nigra, black birch. And so uh, there is no symmetry in the Latin name and colloquial name. So let's rather call this birch cherry birch, because the bark is a little bit like cherry bark or sweet birch. This birch is very distinguished even from the distance, or I should rather say, from the distance you can confuse it with a fir tree or with a spruce, because it's very upright and pyramidal, like a conifer tree almost. And the crown is narrow. The birches branches are very short. They form this beautiful symmetrical narrow crown. And if it's lighted well, the branches go to the very bottom of the tree, covering the trunk, as if it's really a spruce or a fir. And again, look, those leaves are of a very special shape. We haven't yet seen such a shape in birches. Uh, each birch has a very special shape of leaf, so it's easy to remember which is which, and that way identify birches. And another thing, another proof that I was telling you the truth, that oftentimes leaves and birches grow in pairs from one bud. And here you can see leaves growing, uh, forming two pairs. So unfortunately, I'm not able to show you the smell of this branch, especially if you scratch it a little bit. That's how some people who don't rely on their memory identify this birch. They just scratch the bark and smell it. And it has a very distinctive smell of wintergreen. This is wintergreen oil. In fact, cherry birch has been a chief commercial source of wintergreen oil, uh, which was distilled from its wood. Again, the same story about flowering. This is a couple of catkins, male catkins that uh, consists of staminate flowers, flowers with stamens. And these are female catkins or fruiting catkins, the ones that eventually will produce seed. These are fruiting catkins of cherry birch very late in the fall when they already fully ripen. There are no leaves on the birch anymore. Only the catkins are left. And I wanted you to look at this very interesting phenomenon. This birch has started its life on a nourishing log. See, this young birch is growing on an old fallen tree, on the tree trunk. Any fallen tree that is decaying can serve like a nourishing, hospitable cradle for little seedlings of birches. This looks like this. These are all little seedlings of cherry birch that are trying to start their life on this decomposing old log. And cherry birches are famous um, being able to crawl down from some elevated object where they start their lives, then they just expand their roots, reach the ground, and sometimes remain standing on stilt roots if the object decomposes, the object on which they start growing decomposes. Here is the range of cherry birch. You can see that this is a very important Eastern North American tree. This is in fact a dominant tree in the Northern Appalachian forest and the major source of timber there. Now let's look at this giant of a birch. This is also a character. This birch can reach 30 meters in height and it's very long-lived. It's called yellow birch, Betula alleganiensis. So if you think of Betula populifolia, gray birch, as a pioneer successional tree that quickly comes and quickly leaves, this is the total opposite of that. This is one of the long-lived framework trees of New England. Not necessarily it grows to this height. And of course, the bark at this age already doesn't look typical. Typical bark is very beautiful. It looks like this. It's shiny color bronze and it exfoliates in these curly thin layers. In fact, this tree is a real beauty in its like middle part of the middle life. Or it can grow orange like that. So there is variation. There are all different tints of color. And again, it can start life on a nourishing log on some object and then be left on stilt roots like that. See these shiny bronze trunks? This birch, differently from the previous cherry birch that likes to grow on dry, open rocks, often this is a birch of wet habitats, lowlands. Oftentimes it grows in wetlands like that with skunk cabbage and other wetland trees and shrubs. And again, this one has chosen to produce these beautiful stilt roots, and it looks like a real tropical tree like that. Here is the group of male catkins producing stamens. Here is a closer view. We can finally have a look like of this. You can have a glimpse of stamens poking out of the catkin from under each of these little scales. But we have to keep in mind how the male catkins start their life. They actually are preformed during the previous season of the year. The catkins that is flowering that are flowering this spring today, uh, they were formed during the previous fall, and they have been overwintering like this. This is what the yellow birch catkins look in February in winter. They are much shorter and they are covered with this protective film. So they are frost proof, and they are saving this future catkins very well, this frost proof layer. But what about the female catkins? How do they overwinter? Well, it turns out that's a different story with those. They don't get out of the bud during the winter. They overwinter in the bud. And then the next season, the bud opens and produces this kind of catkin. This is already ripe in the fall, in September, but during the vegetation period, at the end of July, for example, they are still green and looking like this. Now, yellow birch grows its catkin like all the rest of the birches during a few months and usually disseminates seed sometime in November when the leaves are already gone and only the catkins remain on the branches. And when this fruiting catkin shatters, uh, it falls apart and produces this scales, these little scales, and the seed itself. The seeds look like this, and here is the seed, and each seed has two little wings. In all birches, seeds are winged like that, and that's why they're called samaras, same way as the seeds of maples, which are also winged. So the seed type is Samara. And the shape of these wings and the shape of these scales in between the seed is very important to biologists because professionals identify birches by the shape of these wings of seed and the shape of scales. For example, here are the seeds of exotic birch, Himalayan birch, Betula utilis, variety Jacquimonti. And this is another famous birch around here because it's very popular with nurseries and they sell it under the name white birch. I remember one conversation with a person who wanted to purchase a native birch for his front lawn. And he said, oh, I bought the birch that was called white birch. Don't tell me that it is not native. And I look at the label and it says Himalayan birch. So sometimes people rely on their knowledge. They believe that this is enough to just think that if a tree is called white birch, it must be native birch here. But actually, the whitest birch with bright white trunk is this Himalayan birch. And this little seed produce seedlings. Seedlings of yellow birch look like this. And yellow birch range is now in front of us. You can tell that yellow birch is a framework tree around here. It its range takes a large chunk of eastern and northeastern North America, northeastern United States, and southeastern Canada. So we have looked at 5 different birches today, and let's review what we saw, uh, because I don't want to confuse you, and I want you to take away a little bit of knowledge about birches. So next time you go uh, for a walk and meet a birch on your way, you'll recognize it and say, oh, this is my old friend. I can name it and I can say hi to it. So here is a couple photographs. In each photograph, you will see 2 different birches growing together. For example, here, this long lived, beautiful bronze colored birch, which is, yes, right, yellow birch, has given shelter to a short-lived pioneer smaller birch, which has whitish bark but not quite white, uh, with grayish and black spots on the bark, which is gray birch, Betula populifolia. And this is again the bank of the long ditch at the confluence with the Charles River. And now you can see that in the center there is this birch with exfoliating bark on the trunks that's stepped right into the river. This is a spring photograph when the water level is very high, and at this time of the year, this front row birches find themselves right in water. But so this must be, right? This must be the river birch or Betula nigra. But the ones that are in the back, a little bit higher, not quite in water, are gray birches, multi-stem also. Both river birch and gray birch are multi-stem birches. The ones in the back are gray birches, Betula populifolia. And here again, we see at the forefront 2 different trees. The one on the right is bright white with exfoliating bark, and that's paper birch. And the one on the left is bronze, shiny, a little bit, mostly on the roots. And it has also exfoliating bark. So this must be Betula alleganiensis or yellow birch. So my point is that you can train your eye and make it possible for you to just identify birches by the bark. But sometimes, of course, they try to decept you. And this one, for example, pretends to be a paper birch with this bright white, beautiful, beautiful trunk. But you know it's not paper birch because there is nothing exfoliating. The bark is too tight, and there are black triangles under the branches, the big limbs. So you know that is just a very beautiful specimen of gray birch. Of course, if there were leaves on the tree, if it were a different season of the year, we could also go by the leaf. Let's try that. This frame contains leaves of 4 different birches. Actually, there are 5 photographs. So I move myself so you can see better here. But these two photographs belong to the same birch. This is triangle shape, leaf shaped like a triangle with a very long tip. I thought that because of the variation, some leaves look more typical than others, and I thought maybe this version of the leaf doesn't look typical enough because the tip is not very long. It has to be even longer most of the time. So this triangle leaves belong to gray birch, right? These leaves look like as if they have plump cheeks here at the base. And so this must be paper birch, right? These are rhombic leaves with big teeth, very coarse teeth. And this must be Betula nigra or river birch. And we have one more photograph that actually represents two different birches. Believe it or not, I cannot tell the difference by just looking at the leaves. I cannot tell yellow birch from Betula lenta, sweet birch. They have pretty darn similar leaves. That's the only occasion where you're not able to tell a birch by the leaf. And so both of them are represented by this photograph. And there is a good reason for that, for this similarity, because these two birches are actually closely related. The fact that they have leaves of similar shape and that they both have this wintergreen odor when scratched means that they belong to very to a to one group of birches. They are very closely related. These groups within the genus are called sections. So these two birches belong to the same section. So how do you tell them apart if they have leaves so similar like that? Well, you have to look, first of all, at the trunk and see if the bark is exfoliating or not. And if it's dark gray steel color, which would be Betula lenta, cherry birch, or if it is bronze and exfoliating, like that, in that case, it would be yellow birch. And the other way to tell yellow birch from cherry birch is to look at the habitat, because cherry birch tends to grow at higher levels on rocks in dry places, and yellow birch is vice versa. It's always near streams or in wetlands, in wet habitats, often even in water. So by judging on the habitat and on the tree bark, you can tell them apart. But sometimes when they grow together, it becomes confusing, especially with young ones. So this was a very short account of what our native birches look like. And I didn't have time to show you problematic cases. In the real world, not all birches are straightforward and easily identifiable. Just because birches are famous for being quite promiscuous. Unfortunately, they can cross and produce hybrids. Uh, and so sometimes you find a tree that has very tight bark, white bark, just the way gray birch is supposed to have, but at the same time, the shape of leaves is reminiscent of paper birch. And you say to yourself, aha, this must be a hybrid of paper and gray birch. And this is quite a common hybrid, actually. And you meet with the situations all the time on the ground. But that's already quite a different story that we may discuss the next time. And today is the very first account of the native birches uh, is coming to its end, and I part with you till the next time. Thank you for your attention and for listening to me. See you again next time.